Major support for these broadcasts is provided by the CUNY TV Foundation, New York Community Bank, Chase Commercial Term Lending, Chelsea Lighting, Capital One Bank, Genova Burns, Giantomasi and Webster, Kilroy Architectural Windows, New York's Window Company, the Wickoff Group, Greenberg Traurig, M&T Bank, Perfect Building Maintenance. Additional support is provided by Ackman Ziff Real Estate Group, Bank of America Merrill Lynch, Briarwood Organization, C.B. Richard Ellis, Colliers International New York, Cushman and Wakefield, Dime Savings Bank of Williamsburg, Douglaston Development, Levine Builders, DDG, Friedman LLP, Accountants and Advisors, Flushing Bank, Herrick Feinstein LLP, Investors Bank, James D. Kuhn Real Estate Center at Syracuse University, James Orphanides, Centurion Holdings, John Katsimatidis, Red Apple Group, Corman Communities, a.k.a. Hotels, Madison Realty Capital, Margolin Weiner and Evans, LLP, Certified Public Accountants and Business Advisors, Massey Knackle Realty Services, New Banks, Meridian Capital Group, Newmark Grubb Knight Frank, Popular Community Bank, Sterling & Sterling, SJP Properties, Stonehenge Partners, and these friends.
His name is Milton Mollen, but nobody knows him as Milton Mollen. They know him as Judge Milton Mollen, but they don't really know everything about Judge Milton Mollen. But what I'm going to tell you is about the boy from Brooklyn, the guy who went to St. John's, the guy who was a prisoner of war. And we're going to spend the next two shows to tell you about the great Milton Mollen, and I'm so happy to have him here today. Thanks for being here.
Great to be here.
So, Milt, let's go back to the family, about your grandparents and then your parents, because something was very interesting about the fruit stand, but tell me about your parents and your grandparents.
Well, my grandparents came over from Russia during the period, I don't know the exact year, but sometime between early 1900s on that. My grandfather was a rabbi and a Hebrew teacher, and he lived in Elizabeth, New Jersey. We lived in, my father and my mother lived in New York City, and they got married. And
now, how'd your father meet your mother?
I didn't know. I never asked him.
You think it was a shidduch, you know, or the matchmaker?
I don't think so. No, I think it was a matter of choice on both their parts.
Okay. Now, you said to me your dad had a fruit stand?
No, he had a fruit and vegetable store. In fact, it was on Broadway in the 80s, I think around 86th Street. It was a very large store, because I used to go and help on weekends, Saturdays and Sundays.
And you said to me something with the horse and buggy?
Well, they would make deliveries. Had these people come in, purchase large orders of fruit and vegetables and things of that kind, and then you would deliver it to them. And at that time, they didn't have that prevalent trucks and things of that kind. So you had a horse and buggy that did it. And every once in a while, as I guess a bribe to me, they let me ride on the horse and buggy with the fellow who was driving the horse and buggy on that. Once in a while, he would let me hold the reins, and as if I was the one driving the buggy.
Now, you lived in Brooklyn, you said to me,
yes.
Even though the business was over
in Manhattan.
And where in Brooklyn did you grow up?
On Union Street. I think the address, if the building may still be standing, it was the biggest building on the street, 2045 Union Street.
Union Street near Eastern Parkway?
Yes, well, between Sutter Avenue and East New York Avenue, and Eastern Parkway was just a couple of blocks above East New York Avenue.
So you grew up in Brownsville section?
Brownsville, East New York. It was like on the border between East New York and Brownsville.
And when you were going to school, you graduated Tilden.
That's right.
And did you have any jobs when you were going, besides, did you work in the store?
Well, I was very active in the school. I was president of the student body, and I was quite active in the school itself. But I didn't really work after school.
So you graduate from Tilden, And this is what, 1938?
Yeah, around there.
1938, and you enroll at City College at night.
Just for, yeah, not even as a matriculated student, but just to take courses, to keep taking additional courses.
And what were you doing during the day?
Working, different jobs. That was during the height of the Depression.
Right.
Those years, 1938, 39, 40.
And then what happened?
Well, Pearl Harbor Day arrived,
Right.
December 7th of 1941, and I decided I wanted to enlist in the Air Corps. And that, I was an avid reader. The two things always interested me in my youth and still interest me, and that's reading, all kinds of reading, and sport activities. And I engaged in both. And I used to read a lot of stories about World War I, and the air fighting at that time. That was the first war, really, World War I, where aircraft were used by any of the parties to the warfare on that. And I used to read these stories, and I developed a desire that I said if I was ever in the military, I would want to be in the Air Corps.
So you enlist in the Air Corps.
Shortly after Pearl Harbor Day, I enlisted in the Air Corps. I had to go down to, I think it was 39 Whitehall Street, if I remember correctly. And I had to take a battery of tests. They give psychological tests, other kind of tests. And they scored you from 1 to 10. And if you had to score 7 or better in order to be qualified, for pilot, navigator, or bombardier. Those were the officers in the air crews, and you had to first pass these examinations. Well, I was fortunate. I did 7 or better in all 3, and I chose pilot training in the first instance on that. But they still did not have facilities available for us. You know, the war had just started, and we weren't prepared in terms of barracks, in terms of the necessary things for training purposes. So they let me stay home. They told me I'll get a telegram one of these days to report for duty at a certain destination.
So you were in the military, but you stayed home until your call on duty.
I'm a great fatalist about life, and that's one of the examples. Because I stayed home, I met my wife. Otherwise, I would never have met her. If I had gone right into the military service.
We call that it was Bichette, right?
Yeah, that's right. It was Bichette. It's exactly right, because it was just odd circumstance. I had an aunt and uncle, and they had one child son who went away to this camp, the sleepaway camp, and it had a boys' side and a girls' side. And my wife was a counselor on the girls' side. Well, my aunt and uncle are very close to this aunt was my mother's sister. My mother died at an early age, and she was only 40 when she passed away. She had a tumor on the brain. And so the aunt and uncle asked me if I wanted to go up with them for the weekend. They were going to visit their son at the camp. So I said, sure, I had nothing better. I was waiting for a telegram to report for active duty. So I went up there, and I had gotten a friend of mine, a close friend, a job as a counselor then, because they were anxious to get people as counselors there. A lot of the boys were getting drafted or enlisting, and so their availability was relatively limited. So anyway, I went up there with them on a Friday, and that evening, my friend was dating this girl. She was a counselor in the girls' side of the camp, and they invited me to go along with them. And then Saturday, we kind of both dated her, and Sunday she was my date, and he was coming along. And ultimately, the owner of the camp that Sunday, before I left with my aunt and uncle, asked if I would take a job with him. He was still short of counselors, and he wanted somebody who could oversee the athletic program for them. So I said, well, I'll go back with my aunt and uncle on Sunday night, and then Monday morning I said, I'll check at 39 Whitehall Street, which is where I had enlisted, and see if there was a likelihood that I was going to be called before the end of the summer. If I was going to be called, there was no point in coming back to the camp. But if I wasn't called, I could spend the summer there as a counselor. So that was where we left it. Monday morning, I went down to Whitehall Street. I went to see this sergeant who I'd met when I was enlisted. That was a place where I had enlisted. And I said to him, do you think I'll going to get called before the end of August, before sometime in September, at the early, or is there no likelihood that that will happen? He really didn't know, but best judgment, he said, I don't think I'm going to be called this summer. Go back. I had told him that it was a question about taking a summer job, so he said, take your job. They'll reach you by telegram if they have to get you, but you can go up there. I think it's pretty safe that you won't be called before the end of the summer.
So this is how you met your wife? And
So I went back, and my wife was a counselor there, and I was a counselor, and we became close friends. But then anyway, the first week in August, I got a telegram. I got a call from home. There was a telegram for me to report to Kelly Field in Texas.
You had told me when we got together that the sergeant or somebody allowed you because your eyesight or something, right?
Yeah, I guess the statute of limitations has run, so I can
Yes.
tell you this story on that. Yes, well, when I was leaving, and he told me I had 20/40 in one eye instead of 20/20, so he said, you come back and see how you take the exam again, maybe it'll be different this time. So I did two things. Before I left the place, I memorized the eye chart. And the second thing I did when I went home was I started eating carrots. I'd heard that eat carrots, it's good for your eyesight. So I lived on carrots for a couple of weeks till I went back to take the exam again. And this time I took the exam, and I had a pretty good memory. I've always had a pretty good memory. So I kind of tried to memorize, and I wrote it down on the chart when I got home that night. The eye chart, I didn't know if it was going to be the same one that I would be confronted with, but I thought I'd take a chance and do that. So when I came back, I read the exam pretty well.
And you got the 20/20.
So I got 20/20. So,
Now,
and then the sergeant was funny. He was a grizzled old guy, regular Army person. And he said to me, he says, Sonny boy, he says, don't think you're fooling me. I know what you did. He said, but if you want to go that badly, go ahead. As far as I'm concerned, you passed the eye exam.
now you did radar training, right?
That was later.
Right.
What happened was first I chose pilot training on that when I went down to Kelly Field. And you go through phases, first phase, second phase, third phase. And when I went, the final phase is third phase. And when I went through the third phase, two things I remember about piloting. First, when I started out, the first 6 times I went up fly with the flight instructor. Each of those 6 times, I threw up in the plane. I got it. So after the 6th flight, the instructor said to me, I can only give you one more chance because there's no point in it if you can't
Right.
fly without throwing up. There's not going to be much use in fighting off the Germans. So he said, let's see how it happens. But the next time that you're airsick again, I'm going to have to wash you out. So I went up, but that was the last time I ever got sick. I haven't been sick in an airplane since then. But it was interesting to me that it was kind of a manifestation of mind over matter. That you make your mind up and you're so totally determined, somehow you can sometimes control circumstances.
So let's talk. You become a radar specialist.
Well, what happened was, in the third phase, the final phase of training, pilot training, I washed out on that. So, but if you had 7 or better in the other 2, either one of them or both of them, navigator and bombardier, you could go into that branch of the training. So I chose navigation. I had better than 7 on the navigation questionnaire. So I decided to go for navigate training. And I remember they sent me to Houston, to Ellington Field near Houston. That's where I had my first training, and then I was sent back to another location. And finally I graduated as a navigator.
Now, during that period, you also got married, right?
No, not yet.
Not yet?
Not yet.
Okay.
Not yet.
So you're a navigator.
And I get assigned to what looked like a very choice assignment, Clovis, New Mexico. Small, pretty little town in New Mexico, not far from White Sands, where the atom bomb program was based on that. And I was squadron navigator. It was my function to put navigators on air crews coming through. They were forming the crews of 10. You had 10. You had a pilot, a co-pilot, a navigator, and a bombardier. Those are the 4 officers. And then you had 6 enlisted men: radio operators, gunners, engineer. We had those. So that, and they comprised the other 6 plus the 4 officers. It was a crew of 10 on that. So then what happened also in between, well, we were getting ready to go overseas. I was a squadron navigator, and I was the one who appointed people, navigators, different crews. I'd look up the records, and I used certain criteria they used and did that. But I thought to myself, this isn't what I enlisted for. So I went to see the commanding officer, and I told him, I said, I want out of this. I didn't enlist to stay in Clovis, New Mexico, and put other people on airplanes going out to combat. So he thought I was kind of a little foolish or crazy. And he said to me, you got the best assignment in the Air Force here. You got a great place, it's relaxed, it's nice.
Don't have to worry, you're not over Germany, right?
The weather was great, all that, it was a great place. But I said, that's not what I enlisted for. So I really went out, I want to go. So he said, finally, he gave up on me, and he said, all right, put yourself on a crew. You're the one who's assigning people to crews. Put yourself on as a navigator, and I'll replace you with another one if that's what you want to do, really want to do that. I said, yes, that's what I want to do.
So you get on a crew, and you go over...
Not yet.
Okay.
Because we finished that 3rd phase training was at Clovis on that, and then I get orders to report to Lincoln, Nebraska. That's where we're going. Now, Lincoln, Nebraska was a departure point for overseas. It was a closed base. You couldn't get off once you're there because of security and all of that. And so we were transferred to go up there, the crew. I was on a member of a crew by this time. And we flew to Lincoln. The other 3 officers were all married. My wife and I were not yet married. But we chipped in, the 4 officers. We bought some junky old car. We gave it to the women, and they drove up from Clovis to Lincoln, Nebraska. The only problem was Lincoln was what they call a closed base, because it was a point of debarkation where we debarked for overseas, and it was therefore you could not go into town or anywhere else. Security was very tight there because of that. So finally, we're about to take off. They line up. There were 30 crews, I remember, taking off. And we're on the line to take off to go fly to England. The British had invented radar at that time to be used in aircraft on that. And until then, we had what they call the Northern Bomb Site. That's how we would drop our bombs, on the Northern Bomb Site. But when you got to a target, if there were clouds over the target, the Northern Bomb Site could not get through the clouds, and you'd have to go to a secondary target. We always had a secondary target if the first one was obscured because of clouds or whatever on that. And go to second target. If the second target was clear, you dropped your bombs there. If it wasn't clear, then you finally go back. You bring your bombs back to England again, and you just don't drop them because of the weather conditions on that. With the radar, however, you could see through the clouds. And it's actually the radar navigator. They created a new classification. So everything in the military is classifications. And originally my classification was navigator. But now I went to this school, Langley Field. I was in the first group of officers that had radar navigation training. And I've got a classification as a radar navigator on that. And then while I was at Langley Field, that's when I got married, because my wife came down for Christmas, came down on December 24th of that year, and I met her at the train. I brought a buddy along with me. Before I did that, I went to the county clerk's office.
Got the license.
I wanted to get the license. I also wanted them to tell me, is there some judge who can perform the ceremony for me, because I didn't know the townspeople there. So, and he did. He knew somebody. He called him. Yes, the judge would be glad to do it, even though it was Christmas Eve and all of that. He said I should come over when I picked up my wife, she got off the train because they weren't using commercial flights at that time. And I tell her, let's go. She said, where are we going? I said, we're going to get married. She said, married? She said, what will my mother say? I said, she'll say congratulations.
Right. Your first mission, when you're flying, you were on this plane. Tell me about the mission that the plane had the problem.
We carried 12 in the crew. The normal crews were 10. We had 2 extras. The 2 extras, we had a command pilot. We always flew lead plane. We led formations. We didn't fly as a group, members of a group or members of a squadron. We would go to a rendezvous point somewhere over England or the English Channel and hook up with a full formation. We would take over the lead as a lead plane. We were called the Pathfinders on that. And we would lead the formation to the target. And when you get to what they call the IP, the initial point, from that point on you do no evasive action. They could have all kinds of fighter planes going at you, the Germans, and anti-aircraft fire. Until you reach the IP, the initial point, you could take evasive action to avoid them. But once you got on at the IP, you went straight for the target. You never swerved, you just went for the target on that. And meanwhile, you had the German fighter planes coming after you, had the anti-aircraft fire, and the mortality rate was pretty high among squadron leading planes on that. In any event, we would do that. And if we got over the target, if it was a clear sight, no clouds, you still would drop at the bomb site. If there were clouds there, we would decide whether or not we had enough vision with the radar to drop the bombs. The radar navigator would drop the bombs. I would use smoke bombs along with the regular bombs because the rest of the formation would drop their bombs when they'd see our smoke bombs going. They would, once they got to that point, they would drop their bombs.
Tell me about the time when the plane gets hit.
We had the longest flight at that time. It was the longest mission from England to Munich. We were going to bomb Munich on that. And we had, again, we picked up our formation and we led the flight, but we really got beat up on the way there. Between German fighter planes and anti-aircraft fire, we had a lot of problems with the plane. When we dropped our bombs, we made it to the target, dropped our bombs, and then turned around and started flying back.
Right, and 4 of you
No, there were 12 in the plane,
right,
and we're flying back, and the command pilot decided, we led the formation, but we were losing gas because our tanks had been hit also. So we told the deputy lead plane to take over the leadership of the squadron, and we figured out a route back to the place, the shortest route possible, because we knew we were going to have a problem with gas, but we'd have enough gas to get back to England on that. We didn't make it back to England. When we were over occupied France, at that time, the Germans still occupied France. We were over occupied France. We almost got to the North Sea, but we didn't quite make it on that, because what the system at that time in play was that if you got back and you couldn't make it back to England, but you could make it to the North Sea, you would ditch your plane in the North Sea, and the English used to send out small boats from England to pick us up and take us back to England. So we were trying to make the North Sea, but we couldn't quite make it. Planes started getting out of control because the command pilot said, bail out. We bailed out. The other 8 were killed. 4 of us got out. When I landed,
your leg was injured.
Yeah, my leg was injured. It fractured my ankle. There's some
right, and
flak.
Right, and then subsequently, the night you end up at a French farmer's place.
We landed on a farm, a French farm. The farmers were there. It was near the end of the afternoon. It was late afternoon. They brought us some bread and cheese, and we stayed low and hidden, and we decided we would travel by night and stay hidden by day. At that time, there were 3 of us together. One of them had landed some distance away. The 3 of us had landed close together on that. So when it got dark, we got up to start to walk. We had our maps out. We knew where we wanted to go on that. I couldn't stand on my leg. It was impossible. It was very painful. And so they didn't want to leave me alone. They said, well, wait. I said, you're not doing me any good by waiting. You're not doing anything for me. I said, the only thing I can hope for is through Frenchmen, I can get to either the resistance, they'll get me some medical attention, or I get a French doctor who would be willing to fix my leg up. So I finally convinced the other two to go, and ultimately the other three, all three, got back. What happened is I started to call when it was dark to a farm. I knocked on the window.
Right.
The Frenchman took me in, and then he put me in the barn for the night. In the morning, he told me to get out. What had happened also that made it tough for the Frenchmen is the Germans were very angry about the fact that Frenchmen were helping Americans and English to get back. So they issued orders that any Frenchman found helping an Allied aviator would be automatically executed on that. So this farmer came into the barn. He says, I had to leave. I said, I can't stand on my leg. I said, get me a doctor or get me the resistance. They'll know how to help me. And we had quite a discussion. He wouldn't. Finally, he said, well, he's going to go visit the village priest, figure out what to do. And he left.
We have to finish this week because, okay, next week we'll continue and talk about the prisoner of war camp and then your career, okay?
Okay.
And I'll see you next week to continue
My
on part
pleasure.
2, okay?